The old apartment building on the outskirts of the city had long been in disrepute with the locals. It stood a gloomy hulk, its gray walls stained with damp, its windows staring out like empty eye sockets. People whispered about the strangeness of the building, but none of them dared to enter it after sunset. Lena had moved into the building recently, renting an apartment on the top floor. She wasn't embarrassed by the rumors. She thought people just liked to make things up. The only thing she didn't like was the creaky stairs leading up to her floor. Each step groaned beneath her feet, as if warning her of something. In the evening, coming home after work, Lena noticed that the light bulb in the entryway had burned out. Darkness enveloped the flights of stairs, leaving only the faint light of her phone. She climbed the first flight of stairs, and suddenly felt the cold air touch her back. The girl looked around, but there was no one behind her. Just a draft, she muttered, trying to convince herself. When Lena got to the second floor, her attention was attracted by strange footprints on the dusty floor. They were barefoot footprints that led upstairs. Her heart pounded faster. She knew that hardly anyone lived in the house. Where could those footprints have come from? Maybe one of the neighbors, she said quietly, not stopping. But with every step she took, an inexplicable feeling of unease came over her. When she reached the fifth floor, the sound of her footsteps suddenly became strange. It was as if someone else was walking at the same time as her, a little louder, but behind her. She stopped. The footsteps stopped, too. Her hands trembled, and the phone almost slipped out of them. "Who's there?" she asked quietly, turning around. There was silence in response, but as she took a step up, the sound came again. It was closer now. She turned on her phone's flashlight and pointed it downward. The light only picked out an empty staircase going into the darkness. Lena began to climb faster, trying not to look back. Her breathing became ragged and her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. Suddenly the stairs began to change. She noticed that there were more flights than usual. It seemed that this endless staircase led somewhere farther than it should. "This can't be," she whispered, looking around. The walls began to darken, as if soaked in a thick black shadow. The air became heavy with the smell of burning and damp earth. Lena felt the ground beneath her feet vibrate slightly, and heard muffled voices. They whispered in an unknown language, growing louder and louder. When she finally reached her door, the keys fell out of her trembling hands. At that moment, a low, husky voice sounded behind her. "Will you come down, or will you stay here forever?" She turned sharply and saw a figure standing in the shadows. Her face was hidden, but her eyes burned with a scarlet light. Lena screamed, but her scream was drowned out by the sound of muffled laughter that echoed throughout the entryway. Lena flew into the apartment, slammed the door shut behind her, and pressed her back against it, trying to catch her breath. The muffled laughter still echoed in her ears, and her heart was racing. She glanced around the room, checking to see if anyone had gone inside, but the apartment seemed empty. Only the lamp on the ceiling flickered, as if it, too, was frightened by the chaos going on. Trying to pull herself together, Lena walked over to the kitchen table, pouring herself a glass of water. A sip of the cold liquid calmed her down a bit, but when she put the glass on the table, she noticed that her hands were still shaking. Questions swirled around in her head. Who was this man? Or, what was that even? Suddenly, there was a sound outside the door. It was a slow, creaky knocking, as if someone was scratching it with their fingernails. Lena froze. Could it be the neighbor? She muttered, trying to convince herself that everything was all right, but her heart was telling her otherwise. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Darkness. Absolute emptiness, as if someone had swallowed the light from the entryway. And then a voice cut through the silence, the same voice, hoarse and low. "Why did you stop? The stairs are waiting for you." Lena recoiled from the door, feeling the fear literally paralyzing her. She clutched her phone and started dialing her friend's number, but the connection suddenly went dead. The screen showed only static, and then it turned off completely. The pounding stopped. There was an oppressive silence that made her ears pop. She walked cautiously to the window, trying to see if anyone was coming from outside, but the street looked strange. The street lights weren't lit, and instead darkness enveloped everything behind the glass. In the distance, where the horizon should have been, there was a thick black fog in which silhouettes seemed to flicker. Lena flinched when she heard a rustle in the hallway outside the door. The sounds were louder this time, as if someone was slowly, laboriously climbing the stairs. Heavy footsteps echoed in the entryway. They were getting closer, first the fifth floor, then the sixth, hers. She heard someone stop in front of her door. Then there was a heavy sigh and then words again. No one has dared to leave yet. The stairs demanded their sacrifices. Lena felt her legs shaking. She wanted to scream, but only a wheeze escaped her throat. She rushed to the closet and pulled out an old lock to reinforce the door in some way. Her fingers trembled as she snapped it shut, but at least it gave the illusion of protection. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp scraping sound. Lena froze. The sound was coming from her bedroom, a bedroom where no one could be. She slowly made her way there, holding onto the wall. The door was ajar. From behind, it came the same whisper she'd heard on the stairs, but now it was closer, louder. Gathering all her courage, Lena pushed the door open. The room was empty, with only moonlight barely filtering through the window. She took a step forward and felt the floor shudder beneath her feet. She lowered her gaze sharply and saw the wooden planks begin to crack. A pale, withered hand emerged from beneath the floor. Then another. Lena screamed, rushing back, but a figure was already rising from the crack. It was a tall, thin silhouette with long arms and a face that was impossible to make out. The deep eye sockets seemed to stare straight into her soul. "You must finish the journey," the creature said, in a voice that sent shivers down her spine. "You must come down." Lena rushed to the apartment door, but it was open from outside. In the opening stood the very figure from the stairs, her scarlet eyes now burning even brighter. At that moment, the ground beneath her feet began to go away, the walls of the apartment melting away as if into thin air. Everything around her spun, and Lena fell into the void. When she opened her eyes, there was neither the apartment nor the stairs, just an endless dark spiral leading somewhere downward, and at the bottom, screams could be heard. She stood at the edge of that spiral, and a figure behind her said, "Welcome, stairs only lead to hell." Lena stood on the edge of a giant spiral leading into endless darkness. Her legs trembled, and the air around her grew heavier and heavier. In the distance, from the depths, there were screams, mixed with a low rumble that seemed to penetrate directly into her consciousness. "It's a dream. It's just a dream," she whispered, clenching her fists as if trying to convince herself it wasn't real. But the reality of this place was frighteningly palpable. The creature behind her took a step forward. Its scarlet eyes flashed like lights, illuminating the dark path. "Do you think this is a dream?" His voice sounded like a thunderclap, burning her ears. "You've already stepped on the stairs. There's no going back." I shouldn't be here." Lena stepped back, but there was an abyss behind her. She almost lost her balance, grabbing onto a stone ledge. "I didn't do anything. Why am I here?" The creature leaned closer, its terrifying face now so close that Lena could feel the coldness emanating from it. "You're not sure about this, are you? Every soul that steps on the stairs carries its own guilt. The only question is whether you'll remember it before you reach the bottom." Lena shook her head. She couldn't remember anything that deserved to be in this place, but the creature's words planted doubt in her mind. A light glimmered on the lower level of the stairs. Lena turned her head and thought she saw someone's silhouette, familiar, but blurred. A voice in her head whispered, "Learn the truth if you dare." Unable to resist any longer, she took the first step down. The step was hard, but cold as ice. With each step, the spiral began to change. The walls that surrounded her were filled with images. There were pictures of people, their suffering, their anger, their sadness. She saw someone screaming, someone crying, and someone silently drifting away into the void. "What is this?" she whispered, feeling the fear mingle with the pain. "It's yours, your past," replied the creature following her in the distance. "Each of these souls is linked to you." "Lies," Lena screamed, but one of the paintings caught her attention. It was of herself. She was sitting at the kitchen table, and her friend Marina was standing across from her. Their voices were muffled, but Lena distinctly remembered that evening. "You could have helped, but you just turned away," said a voice in her head. Lena lowered her eyes. That evening had ended with Marina disappearing. She had asked for help, and Lena, tired of her problems, had simply closed the door. Now that memory was hitting her with renewed vigor. "You could have saved her, but you chose yourself," the creature continued. "This is just one link in the chain. Keep going." Her breathing became ragged, but she continued to descend. The images became more vivid, as if each step was a key to a new page of her life. Memories came flooding back, seemingly insignificant actions that had consequences she hadn't even considered. But the further she walked, the stranger the pictures became. They showed not only her life, but something else: sinister rituals, circles of fire, and people whose faces were hidden under hoods. At the center of it all was herself. "This can't be true. I didn't do it," Lena screamed, but her voice echoed off the walls. "You'll understand everything when you get to the bottom," the creature said, staying behind her. "You've been here before, and you've come back." With those words, the stairs shook violently, and Lena lost her balance. She toppled downward, falling into the endless darkness. Her scream was drowned in the hum of voices calling her name. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a huge hall. The floor was made of black stone, and in the center was a throne on which sat a figure clothed in darkness. A monstrous power emanated from it, shrinking the space around it. "You've made it," a voice said. "Now the choice is yours." Lena rose to her feet, trying to realize what was happening. In front of the throne lay a new staircase, but now it went upward, toward the light. "One step down, and you will stay here forever," the voice said. "Or you can redeem yourself, but the price will be high." She looked at the throne, then at the stairs. Time seemed to stand still as her heart beat its last count. She understood this decision would change everything. Lena stood in the center of the hall, gripped by fear and doubt. There were two realities before her, a staircase leading upward, toward the light, and a throne from which something ancient, inexplicable, and frightening emanated. The air around her was heavy, as if this very choice was weighing on her. "What will happen if I go up?" Lena whispered, looking at the figure on the throne. The creature, clad in darkness, bowed its head lazily, its eyes flaring brighter like coals. "If you go up, you will see the light, but you will leave a part of yourself here. You won't be the same," replied a voice full of menace and a strange sneer. "And if I stay?" The figure on the throne let out a low laugh that sent shivers down Lena's spine. "Then you will become part of this place. You will embrace your darkness. There is no pain here, no suffering, only endless emptiness. Wouldn't that be easier?" Lena shuddered. Emptiness. The word echoed in her mind like an echo that made her want to run away. She looked up at the stairs leading upward. The steps shone with a soft light, as if promising deliverance. But each step upward frightened her more than the fall downward. "Redemption requires sacrifice," said a voice behind her. "You can try, but you already know the price." "What price?" she asked sharply, turning toward the throne. "What will I have to give up?" "You will see those you betrayed," the creature said, rising from its throne. It was taller than Lena had imagined, its shadow covering the entire hall. "You will experience their pain. You will become part of their suffering before you go out into the light." That's impossible," Lena whispered, horrified to realize that her life could turn out to be an endless torture. "It's possible. You chose this path once before, and it brought you here. Now you must choose again." Lena looked at her hands. They trembled. Just as they had the night Marina had disappeared, images from the past flashed before her eyes. People she'd ignored, people she'd let down. Little moments she thought unimportant then were now growing in her mind like rust eating away at her soul. "I can't stay here," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "I have to get out." The figure on the throne answered nothing, but its shadow seemed to smile. Lena took the first step toward the stairs, and the air around her trembled. The light grew brighter with each step, but her legs poured lead and visions began to flicker before her eyes. She saw Marina crying at her doorstep. "You could have helped me," her friend said, looking at Lena reproachfully. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered, rising higher. Next she saw the young man she had once humiliated at school. He stood with his head down and shadows swirled around him, whispering about his weakness. "I didn't know it would be so important to you," Lena said, tears streaming down her face. The higher she climbed, the heavier the visions became. The pain and suffering of people connected to her past overwhelmed her. Their screams and reproaches tore at her heart, but she kept moving. "You won't make it," came the creature's voice, but now it sounded distant. "I can take it," Lena shouted, clinging to the edge of one of the steps. She could feel her body about to give up, but something inside was pushing her to keep going. As she took the last step, the light around her became blinding. Lena covered her eyes, but instead of relief, she felt emptiness. She opened her eyes and saw that she was standing in the middle of her apartment. Everything was the same as before, the familiar walls, the soft light of the lamp, but something had changed. There was a photograph on the floor. It was of herself and Marina. Lena picked it up and felt a strange coldness. Suddenly the photograph flashed fire and disappeared, leaving a scar on her hands in the form of a familiar pattern. A voice echoed in her head. You got out, but you're part of it now. The stairs will always find you. Lena fell to her knees, not knowing what it meant. But one thing she knew for sure, with this night, she would never be the same again. Lena sat on the floor of her apartment, feeling as if the world around her had frozen. The air was dense, as if she was still in that hall. By the throne room and the staircase leading to the light, there was still a scar on her arms, a thin line that seemed to pulse with living fire. It was a dream. It was just a dream, she mumbled, trying to convince herself. But everything around her said otherwise. The clock on the wall had frozen, and there was an unnatural wind coming from the window, howling like a whale. Lena rushed to the mirror to make sure she was alive, that this was her reality. Her reflection stared back at her with wide open eyes, but in the depths of those eyes she saw something alien, as if there was something else behind her gaze. Suddenly a figure appeared in the mirror, the same silhouette that sat on a throne in the depths of hell. Lena recoiled, but the reflection didn't disappear. A voice, familiar and frightening, spoke. You made your choice, Lena. You have risen, but the light you sought requires sacrifice. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to rid herself of the vision, but the voice continued. You are now bound to the ladder. Every soul that steps down will now pass through you. What? No, I don't want it anymore, she screamed, wrapping her arms around her head. You thought redemption was the end? It's only the beginning. You've become a guide. You are the ladder now. Her heart sank. Lena felt the floor beneath her feet shudder. She looked down and saw black stone beginning to emerge from beneath her feet. Smooth steps, like the ones she had seen in hell, began to form around her. The walls of the apartment were disappearing, and in their place was an endless spiral. No, it's impossible. Lena tried to break free, but her legs felt as if they had become attached to the first step. Suddenly a figure appeared in front of her alien she did not know. His face was contorted with fear, and his eyes were pleading for help. Please don't make me go there. I don't deserve this, he shouted, grabbing the edge of the stairs. Lena felt something inside her clench. Her voice, against her will, spoke. You have to come down. She clamped her hands over her mouth, but the words continued as if someone else had spoken them. The man, screaming, took a step down. The stairs swallowed him up, leaving only a dark trail in the air. It's not me, Lena whispered, feeling her soul being torn apart. The voice came again, but now it sounded from inside her. You have become part of the cycle. Every choice has a price. You are now the keeper of the ladder. Lena realized the full horror of her new role. She had become the one who would guide others along the path of redemption, the one who would watch them suffer, and the one who could never leave this place. The room disappeared completely. All that remained was an endless staircase leading downward, and a light barely visible at the top that she would never be able to reach again. Her last scream dissolved into the void. The staircase was left waiting for the next soul.